Welcome everyone to another episode of Mindful Conversations. I'm your host, Sarah, and today we're diving into a fascinating and often contentious topic, healing culture and therapy speak, when boundaries become a weapon. To help us navigate this conversation, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Jessica Moore with us. Jessica is a licensed therapist and an advocate for mental health awareness, and she has a unique perspective on how the language of therapy can sometimes be misused. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here today. This is such an important conversation, especially as more people are becoming aware of their mental health needs. The idea of boundaries is crucial in therapy, but it's interesting how it can be weaponized in everyday life. I think many people struggle with understanding the healthy application of boundaries versus the way they can be misinterpreted to create emotional distance or even manipulation.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. For many, the term boundaries has become almost a buzzword within healing circles. It's meant to empower individuals to protect their well-being, but I've noticed that some folks use it as a shield to avoid responsibility in their relationships. Can you elaborate on how this shift in language can impact interpersonal dynamics?
Definitely. When boundaries are positioned as an impenetrable wall rather than a flexible guideline, it can create a disconnect in relationships. People may declare, "I'm setting a boundary," but what they often mean is, "I'm shutting you out." This can lead to misunderstandings and feelings of rejection, especially when those involved don't have a clear understanding of what healthy boundaries should look like. It's about communication, expressing needs without dismissing others. Therapy should be about fostering connections, not severing them.
That's a powerful distinction, Jessica. It makes me think about how the therapeutic process itself can sometimes be misinterpreted. For instance, a person might come out of therapy feeling more self-empowered but could mistakenly think that empowerment means cutting ties with everyone who makes them uncomfortable. How can we encourage individuals to find that balance between self-care and maintaining healthy relationships?
Encouraging self-awareness is key. People need to recognize their own triggers and the reasons behind their discomfort. It's also essential to remember that relationships require give and take. We should promote the idea that self-care includes open dialogue and vulnerability, rather than just asserting boundaries. Workshops, group therapy, and even community discussions can foster a better understanding of how to express needs while still being in a relationship. Ultimately, it's about finding that sweet spot where personal well-being and healthy connections coexist.
Welcome back to our discussion on healing culture and therapy speak. In our last segment, we explored the origins of the term boundaries and how it has evolved in therapeutic practices. Today, I want to delve deeper into the implications of using boundaries in a way that can feel more like a weapon than a protective measure. Can you shed light on some real-life scenarios where this happens?
Absolutely. One common scenario is when someone uses the concept of boundaries to cut off communication abruptly. For instance, someone might say, "I need to set a boundary and you're toxic, so I'm done." This can be damaging, especially if the relationship isn't truly toxic, but rather, a challenging one that needs dialogue. It's important to recognize that boundaries should serve to protect mutual respect, not to create emotional walls.
That's a poignant observation. It seems like a misunderstanding of boundaries can lead to isolation, rather than empowerment. In your experience, how can individuals strike that balance to ensure boundaries are healthy and constructive?
Great question. It starts with self-awareness. Recognizing why you feel the need to set a boundary is key. It's essential to ask, is this boundary for self-protection or is it a way to avoid uncomfortable conversations? Open communication is vital. Instead of issuing ultimatums, try expressing your feelings and needs while inviting the other person to share their perspective. This fosters understanding and helps both parties feel heard and respected.
Welcome back to our podcast on healing culture and therapy speak. We're diving into a complex topic where boundaries can sometimes feel like a weapon rather than a protective measure. Today, I want to explore the nuances of this concept further. One thing I find fascinating is how boundaries can be misunderstood or misapplied in personal relationships. What are your thoughts on how this misapplication can impact our connections with others?
That's a great question. Many people use the term boundaries as a shield, often to avoid difficult conversations or to justify cutting people off. It's almost as if those terms become buzzwords stripped of their original intent. Healthy boundaries should promote understanding and respect, but when misused, they can create isolation or resentment. I've seen individuals label any form of confrontation as a violation of their boundaries, which can stifle growth in relationships. It's crucial to recognize that boundaries should encourage dialogue, not shut it down.
Absolutely, and that raises an important point about the balance between self-care and communication. When someone feels their boundaries are crossed, it's essential they express it, but how they do it matters greatly. Communication can be a powerful tool for healing, yet it gets lost in the jargon. What advice would you give to someone struggling to communicate their needs without resorting to defensive tactics?
First and foremost, I would encourage them to practice self-awareness. Before labeling something as a boundary violation, they should reflect on their feelings and the situation at hand. Journaling can be a great way to process emotions and clarify thoughts. Once they feel grounded, they can approach the conversation with a sense of curiosity rather than a defensive stance. Phrasing it in terms of, "I feel," rather than, "you did," can significantly shift the tone from accusatory to vulnerable. This way, it opens the door for a collaborative resolution rather than a confrontation.
Welcome back to our ongoing discussion on healing culture and therapy speak. In our previous episodes, we've explored how the rise of therapy language has influenced modern relationships. Today, let's dive deeper into the concept of boundaries. While they can be essential for self-care, there are instances where they seem to be weaponized. How do you think this shift has impacted genuine communication?
It's a fascinating topic. Boundaries, when used effectively, create a safe space for personal growth and mutual respect. However, in some circles, they've evolved into tools for avoidance or even manipulation. Instead of fostering understanding, people may hide behind the term boundaries to disengage or shut down real conversations. This creates an atmosphere of fear, where individuals are hesitant to express their feelings for fear of crossing someone else's line.
Absolutely. It's almost like a catchphrase that has lost its depth. It reminds me of how some people use the idea of boundaries to excuse poor behavior. For example, if someone cuts off a friend simply because they felt uncomfortable with a conversation, it can lead to feelings of isolation rather than growth. How can we encourage people to communicate more openly while still respecting necessary boundaries?
That's the crux of the issue, isn't it? We need to shift the narrative around boundaries to emphasize balance. One approach could be integrating active listening practices into our conversations. Instead of jumping straight to declaring a boundary, we can first articulate our feelings and needs. This way, we create a dialogue rather than a division. Encouraging vulnerability along with boundary setting can pave the way for more meaningful exchanges, where both parties feel heard and respected.
Welcome back to our ongoing series on healing culture and therapy speak. This is part 5 of our discussion, and we've covered a lot of ground so far. Today, I want to dive deeper into how the concept of boundaries can sometimes be misused. Many people regard setting boundaries as an essential part of self-care, but when used incorrectly, it can alienate others. How do you view the line between healthy boundaries and weaponizing them?
That's a really important question. Boundaries, at their core, are meant to protect our well-being and facilitate healthy relationships. However, when individuals use the language of boundaries to cut others off or evade accountability, they can become a tool for manipulation. For example, saying, "I need space," can be genuine, but if it's employed as a way to punish or silence someone, it loses its therapeutic intent and can lead to emotional isolation.
Exactly. It seems like there's a growing trend in social media where people proudly announce their boundaries, often showcasing them in a way that feels performative. This can create an echo chamber where setting boundaries just to prove a point becomes more important than the actual interpersonal relationships involved. How can we navigate this cultural phenomenon without falling into that performative trap?
Great observation. It's about authenticity. We need to ask ourselves whether our boundaries are coming from a place of genuine self-care or if they're merely a reaction to societal pressures. Engaging in self-reflection is crucial. Before we assert a boundary, we should consider the intentions behind it. Are we seeking to foster understanding, or are we just trying to assert dominance? Reframing boundaries as tools for connection rather than separation can help preserve the integrity of our relationships.
Welcome back to our discussion on healing culture and therapy speak. In our previous segments, we touched on how the language of therapy can sometimes be weaponized, especially when it comes to concepts like boundaries. I think it's crucial to explore how these concepts can be misinterpreted or misapplied in everyday interactions. What are some of the common ways you see boundaries being misused in personal relationships?
Absolutely, this is a critical point. One major issue is when people use boundaries as a way to create emotional distance rather than to protect their own mental health. For example, someone might say, "I need to set a boundary," when what they really mean is they don't want to engage in an uncomfortable conversation. This can lead to a lack of accountability and can really stunt the growth of relationships. It's important for us to differentiate between healthy boundaries and those that are more about avoidance.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like a protective shield that can easily turn into a wall. I also wonder about the impact of social media in this context. It seems like people often reference boundaries in a very public manner, which can sometimes feel more performative than genuine. What are your thoughts on this digital aspect of boundary setting?
Great observation. Social media has created a space where boundary setting can sometimes feel like a trend rather than a personal necessity. When individuals post about their boundaries, it can lead to a culture where people feel pressured to share their limits publicly, which may not be appropriate for every situation. This performative aspect can dilute the meaning of boundaries, transforming them from personal safeguards into public declarations. Additionally, it can escalate conflicts, as others might feel judged or attacked by those posts, further complicating interpersonal dynamics.
Exactly. It's like the message gets lost in translation, and instead of fostering understanding, it creates division. And that brings us to the idea of accountability. How can we ensure that when we set boundaries, we're also being mindful of the feelings and perspectives of others involved? Welcome back to part 7 of our series on healing culture and therapy speak. Today, we're diving deeper into the complexities of boundaries in the therapeutic context. Often, we hear the term boundaries thrown around, but can you explain how they can sometimes be misconstrued or weaponized?
Absolutely. The concept of boundaries is essential for personal growth and healthy relationships, but when taken to an extreme or misunderstood, it can become a tool for manipulation. For example, someone might use the idea of needing space as a way to shut down communication or avoid accountability. It's crucial to differentiate between healthy boundaries that promote well-being and those that serve to isolate or control.
That's a great point. I think many people struggle with the balance of asserting boundaries without crossing into that territory of using them as a defense mechanism. How do we encourage open dialogue about boundaries without them becoming a barrier?
One approach is to foster an environment where vulnerability is welcomed. Encouraging individuals to express their feelings and needs can help demystify boundaries. This means creating spaces where people feel safe enough to say, "I need this," or "I'm uncomfortable with that," without fear of backlash. It's about mutual understanding, allowing for growth, and recognizing that boundaries can evolve.
Yes, I love that idea of evolving boundaries. It seems like so much of this comes back to communication skills. What role do you think effective communication plays in maintaining healthy boundaries?
Communication is key. When we articulate our needs and listen to others, we create a roadmap for navigating boundaries together. It's about being clear, but also being open to feedback. That way, if someone feels a boundary is being crossed, they can express that without fear of escalation. This establishes trust and promotes a culture where boundaries are respected rather than weaponized.
Welcome back to part 8 of our series on healing culture and therapy speak. Today, we're diving deeper into a topic that resonates with many: the concept of boundaries and how they can sometimes be misused. To reiterate, Boundaries are crucial for healthy relationships, but when they become weapons, they can lead to manipulation and emotional harm. Can you elaborate on how this misuse manifests in everyday interactions?
Absolutely, it's a nuanced issue. Often, we see individuals using the language of boundaries as a shield rather than a tool for healthy communication. For instance, someone might say, "I need space," but what they really mean is, "I'm unwilling to engage with you." This can create a barrier that feels exclusive and can alienate the other person. It's essential to differentiate between healthy boundary setting and using boundaries as a way to avoid accountability or intimacy.
That's a great point. It raises the question of accountability and emotional labor. When someone sets a boundary, ideally it should be a mutual understanding, right? But what happens when one party feels the weight of maintaining that boundary alone? How does that impact the relationship?
Exactly. When boundaries are unilaterally imposed, it often leads to one-sided relationships where the other person feels rejected or powerless. This can create a cycle of resentment. Ideally, boundaries should encourage dialogue. For instance, instead of shutting someone out, saying, "I need some time to process my feelings," opens the door for conversation and understanding. It emphasizes that boundaries are not about shutting down, but rather about fostering healthier dynamics. It's all about the intention behind the boundary.
As we dive deeper into this conversation about boundaries, I can't help but think about how the concept of boundaries has evolved over time, especially in the context of therapy speak. It seems like many people are using the term boundaries almost as a weapon rather than a tool for healthy relationships. How do you see this trend impacting people's ability to connect with one another?
Absolutely, it's fascinating and concerning at the same time. I think the misuse of the term boundaries can create an emotional distance rather than foster healthy connections. People may feel validated in cutting others off or shutting down conversations when they feel uncomfortable, which can lead to isolation. When boundaries are weaponized, they lose their protective function and instead become an excuse for avoiding vulnerability and meaningful dialogue.
That's a compelling point. Vulnerability is such a crucial part of human connection. It makes me wonder how this shift in understanding boundaries affects the healing process within therapy. For those in therapy, could this weaponization hinder their progress by creating more walls instead of healthy separations?
Precisely. In therapy, the goal is often to navigate complex emotional landscapes, and when clients adopt a rigid view of boundaries, it can sabotage that process. They might become fixated on protecting themselves to the point where they miss opportunities for growth and understanding. Healing often requires us to lower those defenses, engage with our emotions, and sometimes, that means confronting discomfort instead of escaping it. It's a fine balance between protecting oneself and being open to the healing power of connection.
Welcome back to our ongoing series on healing culture and therapy speak. Today, we're diving deeper into the topic of boundaries, specifically, how they can sometimes be weaponized in interpersonal relationships. Let's explore this through personal anecdotes and insights. So, can you share an example from your experience where boundaries were misused, highlighting how that impacted the dynamics?
Absolutely. I remember a situation where a friend of mine insisted on setting boundaries regarding communication, claiming it was for their mental health. However, it quickly became apparent that they were using these boundaries to avoid deeper conversations and accountability. Instead of fostering a healthy dialogue, it created a wall between us. I felt sidelined and confused about how to support them while respecting their wishes. It illustrated how boundaries, when misapplied, can hinder genuine connection rather than promote it.
That's a powerful example. It raises the question of intent behind setting boundaries. How do we differentiate between healthy boundaries aimed at self-care and those that are used defensively or even manipulatively? Is there a fine line we should be aware of?
Definitely, intent plays a crucial role. Healthy boundaries are usually communicated clearly and allow for dialogue. They invite understanding rather than shutting people out. On the other hand, when boundaries become a defense mechanism, they often lack clarity and can lead to feelings of rejection. Recognizing this difference requires self-awareness and reflection. We should ask ourselves, Are we creating space for healing and understanding, or are we shutting others out to avoid discomfort? It's important to cultivate healthy conversations around boundaries, ensuring they serve as a tool for connection, not division.
As we dive deeper into the nuances of healing culture and therapy speak, let's talk specifically about how this notion of boundaries can sometimes be misused. I think many people enter therapy with a genuine desire to improve their relationships, but then start wielding the concept of boundaries as a way to push people away. What are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, I see this quite often. Boundaries are essential for healthy relationships, but when they become a tool for avoidance or disconnection, it can be detrimental. This can lead to a sense of entitlement in saying, "I need this boundary," without recognizing how it might impact others. People forget that setting a boundary should ideally be a two-way street, allowing for open dialogue rather than a unilateral decision.
That's a great point. It seems like there's a fine line between protecting oneself and isolating oneself. In your experience, how can individuals recognize when they've crossed that line? What signs should they be looking for?
A key indicator is the emotional response from others. If you find that your boundaries are consistently eliciting negative reactions or loneliness, it might be worth reflecting. Another sign is persistent feelings of guilt or anxiety about those boundaries. It's also important to evaluate whether these boundaries facilitate growth or if they shield you from necessary conflict. Sometimes, engaging in difficult conversations is essential for deeper healing, and if we're too rigid, we might miss those opportunities.
As we dive deeper into the nuances of healing culture and therapy speak, I can't help but reflect on how boundaries, while essential for self-care, can sometimes be misinterpreted or weaponized. It's almost as if the language of therapy has become a shield for defending our actions, rather than a tool for genuine healing. What do you think has led to this shift in perception?
Absolutely, and it's a fascinating topic. I think part of it stems from the growing popularity of mental health awareness. With more people talking about their experiences and advocating for emotional well-being, terms like boundaries have entered our everyday vernacular. However, this increased discourse can sometimes lose its nuance. When someone says, "I need to set a boundary," it can feel dismissive if not contextualized properly. The intent behind setting that boundary is often overlooked, leading to misunderstandings.
Right, and that's where the danger lies. Instead of fostering open communication, setting a boundary can sometimes lead to a stalemate in relationships. Have you seen examples in your practice where clients have struggled with this concept? How do you guide them in navigating these complex dynamics?
Definitely. Many clients come in feeling guilty about needing boundaries, or they might use them as a way to avoid deeper issues. In therapy, I encourage them to explore the motivations behind their boundaries. Are they protecting themselves from genuine threats, or are they responding to fear or past trauma? This exploration often leads to richer conversations about vulnerability and intimacy, which are just as important as the boundaries themselves. It's about finding that balance, and sometimes that means having tough conversations.
As we dive deeper into this conversation, I want to explore the idea of boundaries not just as personal shields but as tools for manipulation. It's interesting how some people weaponize the language of self-care and boundaries, using it to distance themselves from accountability. Can you share an example of how this plays out in therapeutic settings?
Absolutely. I've seen many clients who come into therapy feeling overwhelmed, and they often express a desire for healthier boundaries. However, sometimes those boundaries serve as walls rather than protective measures. For instance, a client may decide to cut off communication with a family member, citing the need for space. While this can be valid, it can also become a way to avoid confronting deeper issues, like unresolved conflicts or feelings of guilt.
That's a great point. It really highlights the importance of intention behind setting boundaries. When it comes from a place of avoiding pain rather than fostering growth, it can hinder relationships rather than help. How do you guide your clients to ensure their boundaries are truly healthy and not just a means of escape?
I often encourage clients to reflect on their motivations and the outcomes they desire. It's about asking themselves, is this boundary serving my growth, or is it a way to avoid uncomfortable feelings? I also emphasize the importance of communication. Boundaries shouldn't be set in a vacuum. They need to be shared and discussed with those involved. This openness can help transform a potentially isolating boundary into a collaborative effort towards better understanding and care.
As we delve deeper into this notion of boundaries, I think it's important to explore how these concepts can sometimes be weaponized in our interactions. I've seen this happen with people using boundaries as a way to disengage or to shut someone down, rather than fostering a genuine conversation. What are your thoughts on how this can affect relationships?
Absolutely, and it's a critical issue. When boundaries become tools for avoidance rather than protection, it can lead to a breakdown in communication. I often remind my clients that boundaries should serve to enhance relationships, not hinder them. It's about finding that balance, setting limits while still being open to discourse. When someone uses their boundaries defensively, it can feel like a barrier, shutting others out rather than allowing for healthy dialogue.
Right, and that brings me to the idea of emotional intelligence. Understanding when and how to apply boundaries is, in itself, an emotional skill. It's not just about saying no or putting up walls. It's about being aware of your own emotional triggers and how they impact your interactions. How can people cultivate this kind of emotional awareness in their relationships?
Great point. One effective way is through self-reflection. Journaling can be instrumental. It allows individuals to process their feelings and identify patterns in their responses. Additionally, engaging in active listening during discussions can foster empathy and understanding. When people can recognize their emotions and those of others, they can better navigate boundaries without resorting to defensiveness. It's a practice of being open yet intentional, which is crucial in maintaining healthy connections.
As we come to the end of our discussion, let's reflect on how the concept of boundaries has evolved in today's healing culture. While setting boundaries is essential for personal wellness, we must also be aware of how this can sometimes be weaponized. How do you see the balance between healthy boundaries and the potential for manipulation in interpersonal relationships?
That's a crucial point. Boundaries should act as a guide for our relationships, helping us to maintain our emotional safety. However, when individuals use the language of boundaries to dismiss others or avoid accountability, it turns into a weapon. For example, someone might say, "I need space," but they might be using that as a way to shut down necessary conversations about feelings or issues. It's important to approach boundaries with a mindset of mutual respect rather than as a shield against vulnerability.
Exactly. It seems that the context of how boundaries are communicated plays a significant role. We live in a time where emotional literacy is being emphasized, but we must ask ourselves, are we truly understanding each other, or are we simply opting out of conflict? How can we encourage more constructive communication while still honoring the need for boundaries?
Encouraging open dialogue is key. We should foster environments where people feel safe to express their needs without feeling attacked or invalidated. This might involve using language that invites conversation rather than shutting it down. Phrases like, "I feel overwhelmed when," can help others understand our boundaries without making them feel accused or defensive. Ultimately, the goal should be connection, not division. By prioritizing empathy, we can redefine how we communicate boundaries, ensuring they serve our relationships rather than harm them.
That's a powerful takeaway. Empathy really is the cornerstone of healthy relationships. As we wrap up today's episode, what final thoughts would you like to share with our listeners about navigating this complex landscape of boundaries and therapy speak?
I'd say that it's essential for everyone to reflect on their own boundaries and how they communicate them. Let's remember that boundaries are not just about saying no, but about creating a space where both parties feel respected and heard. Being mindful of how we express our needs can prevent misuse of the terminology, allowing us to foster healthier, more authentic connections. So, let's all strive for communication that builds bridges rather than walls.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's been an enlightening conversation about the nuances of boundaries and the importance of empathetic communication. To our listeners, remember, healing culture is about growth and connection, not division. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to having you with us next time.